What kind of world laughs at a pair of worn shoes, but never notices the heart that keeps walking? The first snow of early winter had settled across the village of Ashwood, covering every rooftop and cobblestone street in a blanket of quiet white, while the annual Harvest Moon Festival filled the central square with music, laughter, and colorful banners dancing in the crisp afternoon breeze. Merchants proudly displayed handcrafted goods, children chased one another between wooden market stalls, and families gathered around warm fire pits, sharing fresh bread and steaming apple cider. Yet among all the cheerful voices, one figure walked alone, carrying nothing but a small woven basket filled with medicinal herbs and a quiet dignity that no one seemed willing to see. Emma Collins, a 22-year-old orphan Omega with fair skin, long chestnut hair, and gentle blue eyes, lowered her gaze only long enough to avoid stepping on loose stones as she crossed the crowded square. Her faded gray cloak had been carefully mended countless times, and the old leather shoes beneath it were patched together with worn strips of cloth and hand-stitched thread. They had belonged to her late mother, and although every repair made them look more fragile, Emma cared for them with the same patience she offered everyone else. The moment she reached the center of the marketplace, a sharp laugh broke through the cheerful music. Another followed. Within seconds, several voices joined together until the laughter echoed across the square. "Look at those shoes," one young woman whispered loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I have seen scarecrows dressed better." A group of teenagers glanced toward Emma before quietly laughing among themselves. Even a few adults shook their heads with pity disguised as amusement. Emma paused for only a single heartbeat. Her fingers tightened gently around the basket handle, but she did not answer. She simply inhaled the cold mountain air and continued walking with calm, measured steps, refusing to let humiliation decide the direction of her day. A small boy standing beside his father looked at Emma's shoes before asking innocent curiosity, "Why does she not buy new ones?" His father smiled awkwardly instead of answering, unwilling to explain a kind of poverty that many preferred to ignore. Emma heard the question, yet her expression remained peaceful. She had learned long ago that silence often carried greater strength than wounded pride. As she passed the village fountain, an elderly woman accidentally dropped several small bundles of herbs onto the icy ground. Before anyone else reacted, Emma quietly knelt despite the freezing stones beneath her worn shoes. She carefully gathered every bundle, brushed away the snow, and returned them with a warm smile. "The roots are still dry," she said gently. "They will keep well if you store them near the fireplace tonight." The elderly woman thanked her sincerely, unaware that several people who had mocked Emma only moments earlier now watched in uncomfortable silence. At the far edge of the square, beneath the shadow of an ancient oak tree, a tall traveler wrapped in a dark winter cloak observed everything without speaking. His face remained partly hidden beneath the hood, but his steady eyes followed every movement Emma made. He did not look toward her shoes. He watched the way she comforted the elderly woman, the patience in her voice, and the quiet grace with which she accepted humiliation without allowing it to harden her heart. While the crowd slowly returned to its celebration, the mysterious traveler remained exactly where he was, as though waiting for something only he understood. Emma continued toward the narrow path leading beyond the village, unaware that the stranger's gaze never left her. She believed the afternoon would end like every other, carrying home her basket of herbs and another memory she would quietly bury inside her heart. She did not know that someone had just witnessed not the condition of her shoes, but the extraordinary strength of the woman walking in them, and before the next sunrise, that silent observation would begin changing the destiny of an entire kingdom. Emma Collins followed the narrow path leading away from the festival until the laughter behind her faded into nothing more than a distant echo carried by the winter wind. The woven basket resting against her arm felt heavier than usual, not because of the herbs inside, but because every careless word spoken in the village square lingered quietly in her thoughts. Even so, she refused to let those voices become louder than the values her parents had taught her before they were gone. Kindness was never meant to depend upon comfort, and dignity was never measured by the condition of a person's clothing. As the afternoon sun slowly slipped lower across the snow-covered hills, Emma noticed a young boy struggling beside the forest trail. A bundle of firewood had slipped from his small wooden sled, scattering branches across the icy ground. The child knelt in frustration, trying to gather everything before the approaching clouds promised another snowfall. Without hesitation, Emma placed her own basket beside the path and quietly helped collect every piece of wood. She carefully tied the bundle more securely with a length of spare twine she carried for repairing herb baskets. The little boy looked up with grateful eyes. "Thank you, Miss Emma," he whispered. "I thought I would never get this home." Emma smiled warmly. "Now your family will have enough wood to stay warm tonight." She gently brushed the snow from his coat before watching him disappear safely down the trail. Hidden several yards away beneath towering pine trees, the mysterious traveler remained unnoticed. He had followed at a respectful distance since leaving the village square, saying nothing, interrupting nothing, simply observing. He watched as Emma gave away her only piece of strong twine without expecting anything in return. He noticed that although her own shoes were barely holding together, she never complained about the cold. Instead, her first concern remained someone else's comfort. A thoughtful expression crossed his face. Very few people revealed their true character while believing no one was watching. Emma continued walking until she reached the small wooden footbridge crossing a narrow stream at the edge of the forest. There she found an elderly man attempting to pull a heavy sack of grain across the slippery planks. The load became caught between two weathered boards, refusing to move any farther. Emma immediately stepped forward. Together they slowly lifted the sack free and carried it safely to the opposite side. The old man thanked her several times before offering a few silver coins. Emma gently shook her head. "Please use them to buy fresh bread," she said softly. "That will help you much more than paying me." As the elderly man continued home, the traveler quietly approached the bridge after he had gone. For the first time, Emma noticed him standing only a few feet away. His dark winter cloak concealed nearly everything except calm gray eyes that carried unusual warmth. "You help everyone," he said in a gentle voice. Emma looked slightly surprised before offering a polite smile. "People have helped me before. I simply try to return the kindness." The traveler glanced briefly toward her worn shoes before looking back into her eyes. Unlike everyone else in the village, there was no pity in his expression, only quiet respect. "Does it never become exhausting?" he asked. Emma considered the question for a moment. "Being kind can be difficult," she answered honestly. "But becoming bitter would be much heavier to carry." The traveler remained silent, as though her words had confirmed something he had long hoped to find. Before Emma could ask his name, distant festival horns echoed across the valley, signaling the beginning of the evening ceremony back in Ashwood. The traveler looked toward the sound, then back at Emma with a faint smile that revealed neither his purpose nor his identity. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "some journeys begin with nothing more than a single pair of worn shoes." With those mysterious words, he stepped aside and allowed Emma to continue walking toward her small cottage, while he remained standing on the bridge, watching the fading winter light reflect across the footprints she left behind in the snow. The next morning arrived wrapped in pale golden sunlight that filtered gently through the frost-covered branches surrounding Emma Collins's small wooden cottage. The modest home rested at the edge of Ashwood where the forest quietly embraced the village, far enough away that laughter from the marketplace rarely reached her doorstep. Emma stepped outside carrying a bucket of fresh water drawn from the nearby spring before sunrise. She carefully watered the small collection of winter herbs growing inside handmade wooden boxes protected beneath glass covers. Every plant had a purpose. Some eased fevers. Others soothed aching joints. A few could calm frightened children during long winter nights. She smiled softly as she inspected each one, grateful that even the smallest garden could still offer hope to someone in need. Inside the cottage, a single pair of worn leather shoes rested beside the fireplace. Emma gently picked them up and examined the stitching she had repaired countless times over the years. She threaded another length of sturdy linen cord through a loose seam before carefully tightening every knot. The leather had become thin from years of walking forest trails, yet she polished the old shoes with natural oil until they carried a quiet shine. They were no longer beautiful by ordinary standards, but they represented every mile her parents had once walked beside her before she became an orphan. To Emma, replacing them had never felt as important as honoring the memories they carried. After placing the repaired shoes back onto her feet, She filled her basket with dried herbs, fresh bread, and 2 small jars of healing salve before beginning her daily visits. Her first stop was the cottage of Mrs. Evelyn Harper, an elderly widow whose stiff hands often made ordinary chores difficult during the colder months. Emma quietly knocked before entering with permission. She prepared warm herbal tea, restocked the medicine shelf, and listened patiently as Mrs. Harper shared stories from many winters ago. When the grateful woman attempted to pay her with a few carefully saved coins, Emma gently closed the older woman's hand around them. "Please keep them," she said with her familiar gentle smile. "You may need them before spring arrives." Mrs. Harper watched her leave with grateful eyes, wondering how someone who owned so little could continue giving so much. Unseen by either woman, the mysterious traveler stood across the narrow road beside a weathered stone fence. His hood remained lowered just enough to conceal his identity while allowing him to observe without interruption. He had risen before dawn and quietly followed Emma's path through the village, expecting perhaps to discover a hidden ambition or secret reward behind her endless kindness. Instead, every hour only confirmed what he had witnessed the day before. Emma never paused to see whether anyone noticed her generosity. She simply helped because helping felt natural. Later that afternoon, as Emma crossed the village square carrying an empty basket home, several of the same young people who had laughed at her shoes noticed the fresh stitching along the worn leather. One whispered something that caused the others to smile again. Emma heard them, yet continued walking with peaceful composure. The traveler observed the exchange from beneath the awning of a nearby bakery. His expression remained calm, but there was unmistakable disappointment in his eyes as he watched how easily people judged what they barely understood. When Emma disappeared down the forest path leading home, he slowly removed one leather glove and looked thoughtfully at the signet ring hidden beneath it, a symbol few people in the kingdom had ever seen up close. He quietly closed his hand again before speaking almost to himself. A kingdom reveals its true character by the way it treats those who have nothing to offer except goodness. As evening settled across Ashwood and lanterns began glowing warmly inside village windows, the traveler turned his gaze toward the town square, where another public gathering would begin the following day. He already knew exactly where he intended to stand, and before that gathering reached its end, every person who had measured Emma's worth by the condition of her shoes would be forced to measure themselves instead. The following afternoon, the village square overflowed with even more people than the day before as musicians played lively melodies and vendors welcomed visitors from neighboring packs who had traveled many miles to attend the final celebration of the Harvest Moon Festival. Bright ribbons fluttered between wooden poles while the scent of fresh bread and roasted apples drifted through the cold air. Emma Collins entered the square carrying a small basket filled with healing herbs requested by several families. She hoped to deliver them quickly before returning home before sunset, but the moment she stepped onto the main street, familiar whispers began following her once again. A young merchant glanced toward her repaired shoes and laughed quietly. Another pointed without trying to hide his amusement. Soon several others looked down instead of looking into her eyes, as though the worn leather beneath her feet somehow mattered more than the kindness she had shown every one of them. Emma slowed for only a moment before continuing forward with the same calm grace that had become her quiet shield. She reminded herself that another person's opinion could never erase the truth of who she was. Across the square, the mysterious traveler watched everything unfold from beside the old stone fountain. His hood remained low, but his eyes reflected neither surprise nor anger. Instead, there was a deep sadness that people could overlook genuine goodness so easily. He waited until Emma reached the center of the marketplace, where the laughter grew loudest. Then, without speaking, he began walking directly toward her. The crowd gradually fell silent, curious about the stranger whose quiet confidence seemed untouched by the noise surrounding him. Emma looked up as he stopped only a few feet away. She recognized the calm gray eyes from the forest bridge and offered the same gentle smile she had given everyone else. Before she could greet him, the traveler slowly bent down. He reached for the leather boots protecting his feet from the frozen ground and carefully untied each lace. Without hurry or hesitation, he removed both boots and placed them neatly beside the fountain. A wave of confusion swept through the crowd. The icy stone beneath his bare feet glistened with melting frost. yet he showed no sign of discomfort. Emma stared in surprise, uncertain what he intended to do. The traveler simply looked at her with quiet respect before taking his first barefoot step beside her. Then another. Together they walked across the cold cobblestones at the same unhurried pace. No speech announced his purpose. No explanation filled the silence. His actions spoke more clearly than any proclamation ever could. Every person watching understood the message even before a single word was spoken. If the woman with worn shoes deserved ridicule, then he would gladly choose to walk with even less. The laughter disappeared completely. Mothers lowered their eyes. Merchants who had mocked Emma suddenly found themselves unable to meet her gaze. Children looked from the stranger's bare feet to Emma's patched shoes with puzzled expressions, sensing that something important had just happened. Emma felt emotion rise quietly within her chest, not because someone had defended her, but because someone had finally seen her without measuring her by appearances. She slowed her steps and whispered softly, "You do not have to do this." The traveler answered with a peaceful smile that carried quiet certainty. Respect is never heavy to carry. They continued walking side by side through the silent square, while every set of eyes followed them. High above the village, the distant sound of ceremonial horns echoed across the valley. The traveler lifted his head slightly as though expecting the signal, while beyond the northern gate a line of mounted royal guards had just appeared on the snow-covered road, riding steadily toward Ashwood with banners that shimmered beneath the fading afternoon light. The sound of ceremonial horns rolled across the valley with such unmistakable authority that every conversation in the village square came to an abrupt halt. Snowflakes drifted gently through the late afternoon sky as dozens of mounted royal guards entered Ashwood in perfect formation, their polished silver armor reflecting the fading sunlight. Each rider carried the crest of the crown pack upon deep blue banners that fluttered proudly above the crowd. Villagers instinctively stepped aside, lowering their heads with quiet respect as the procession advanced toward the center of the square. Emma Collins stood frozen beside the mysterious traveler, uncertain why the royal escort had suddenly arrived in their quiet village. The traveler remained calm, his bare feet still resting upon the cold stone as though the winter air no longer touched him. The captain of the royal guards guided his horse forward before stopping only a few feet away. Without hesitation, he dismounted, placed one hand over his heart, and bowed deeply before the quiet traveler. Every guard behind him immediately followed, kneeling in perfect unison. A wave of stunned silence swept across the marketplace. The captain lifted his head and spoke with clear respect that echoed through the square. "Your Majesty, the Royal Council has completed the inspection you requested. The Northern Territories await your return whenever you give the order." Emma's blue eyes widened with disbelief. Around her, merchants, visitors, and villagers stared in complete astonishment. The stranger who had walked beside her without shoes, the man who had spoken with gentle humility and offered respect without asking for recognition, was none other than Alpha King Benjamin Foster, the ruler whose wisdom and fairness had become known throughout every allied pack. One after another, the people who had mocked Emma only moments before slowly realized whom they had ridiculed through their treatment of her. Several immediately lowered themselves to one knee, while others stood speechless, their earlier confidence replaced by deep embarrassment. Benjamin calmly reached into his cloak and removed the simple traveler gloves that had hidden the royal signet ring resting upon his hand. The silver crest caught the winter light, leaving no room for doubt. Yet instead of accepting the attention surrounding him, he turned first toward Emma. His expression remained exactly as it had been from the beginning, warm, peaceful, and entirely free from judgment. Emma instinctively stepped back. "Your Majesty," she whispered softly, beginning to lower herself in respect. Before she could kneel, Benjamin gently extended his hand. "Please remain standing, Miss Collins." His voice was calm, but carried the quiet authority of someone who never needed to raise it. "Today you have done nothing that requires you to bow before me." Emma slowly looked up, surprised not only by his kindness, but by the fact that he already knew her name. Benjamin offered a reassuring smile before facing the gathered villagers. His eyes moved across every familiar face that had filled the square with laughter only a short time earlier. No anger appeared in his expression, only disappointment. He glanced briefly at the worn shoes Emma still wore with quiet dignity, then lowered his gaze to his own bare feet resting upon the frozen stone. The contrast needed no explanation. The lesson had already begun long before anyone understood who he truly was. The silence became so complete that even the festival musicians had lowered their instruments. Children stood beside their parents without speaking. Snow continued falling gently, as though the entire village itself had paused to listen. Benjamin took one slow step forward and allowed his eyes to meet those of the crowd. "Titles reveal authority," he said quietly, "but character reveals worth." No one answered. Many could not even lift their heads. In that moment, the people of Ashwood realized that the greatest difference between the Alpha King and themselves had never been the crown he wore. It was the compassion he carried even when no one knew his name. No one moved. The only sound left in the village square was the quiet whisper of snow settling across the rooftops and the soft breathing of people who suddenly realized they had become witnesses to a lesson far greater than any festival celebration. Alpha King Benjamin Foster slowly looked across the crowd, allowing the silence to linger long enough for every heart to hear what pride often refused to accept. His royal guards remained kneeling behind him, waiting patiently, while he stood upon the frozen cobblestones with bare feet beside Emma Collins, making no effort to reclaim the boots resting near the old fountain. He finally spoke with the same calm voice that had first greeted Emma at the forest bridge. "Tell me something." His eyes moved gently from one face to another. "If a pair of worn shoes can make you believe someone is worth less than you, what does that say about the eyes doing the judging?" No one answered. Several villagers lowered their heads even farther. The young merchant who had laughed first stared silently at the ground, unable to meet the king's gaze. Benjamin continued without raising his voice. "Yesterday, I entered your village as a traveler. None of you recognized me. No banners announced my arrival. No guards walked beside me. You welcomed me with kindness because you believed I was ordinary. Yet many of the same people looked at this young woman and decided her value before hearing a single word she had spoken." His eyes turned toward Emma for a brief moment before returning to the crowd. "During the last 2 days, I watched her help a child gather firewood, assist an elderly man across an icy bridge, care for a widow without accepting payment, and offer compassion even to those who never returned it. Not once did she complain. Not once did she ask for recognition." The words settled over the square with quiet weight. Mrs. Evelyn Harper stepped forward from among the villagers, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. "Everything His Majesty says is true. Emma has cared for me through every winter since my husband passed away. I offered payment many times, but she never accepted a single coin." Soon another voice joined hers. The elderly man from the bridge nodded respectfully. "She carried my grain when my own strength failed." Then the young boy Emma had helped with the firewood looked up at his father and spoke with innocent honesty. "She fixed my sled so my family could stay warm." One memory after another surfaced from the crowd. Families quietly remembered medicines delivered during sickness. Children remembered comforting smiles after difficult days. Farmers remembered herbs freely given during poor harvests. Piece by piece, the image they had created of Emma began giving way to the truth they had ignored for years. Benjamin waited patiently until every voice faded once more. "Character is revealed through ordinary moments," he said softly. "Not through wealth, not through appearance, not through comfort. The strongest hearts often wear the simplest clothing because they spend their strength lifting others instead of themselves." Emma felt tears gathering in her eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. She had never wanted public praise. She had only hoped to live quietly with dignity. Benjamin turned toward her with a gentle smile, filled with sincere respect. "Miss Collins, your kindness did not become valuable today because a king noticed it. It was valuable long before anyone chose to see it." Those words reached every corner of the silent square. For many standing there, shame slowly transformed into understanding. They had believed they were judging a poor orphan. Instead, they had revealed the poverty within their own compassion. And as the evening light settled softly across Ashwood, the lesson that began with a simple pair of worn shoes quietly started changing far more than one woman's reputation. It began changing the hearts of an entire village. For several long moments, no one spoke. The weight of truth rested more heavily upon the village than the winter snow covering every rooftop. Emma Collins stood quietly beside Alpha King Benjamin Foster, still struggling to understand why the ruler of the Crown Pack had chosen to defend someone as ordinary as herself. She looked down at her carefully repaired shoes and remembered every mile they had traveled through lonely forests, every house where they had carried medicine, and every difficult season they had endured together. Nothing about them had changed, yet somehow the entire world around her suddenly had. Benjamin slowly bent down and picked up the leather boots he had left beside the old fountain. Instead of putting them back on immediately, he carried them in one hand as he turned toward Emma with a warm smile. "Miss Collins," he said gently, "would you do me the honor of walking beside me through your village?" Emma looked at him with quiet surprise. "Your Majesty, I am only an orphan, Omega." Benjamin softly shook his head. "No, you are a woman whose character has already earned the respect many spend their entire lives searching for." He offered his hand, not as a command from a king, but as an invitation between equals. After a brief hesitation, Emma accepted with quiet humility. Together, they began walking through the center of Ashwood, while the royal guards respectfully followed several steps behind. The villagers instinctively moved aside, creating a wide path before them. Yet this time, every eye looking toward Emma carried something completely different from the day before. The laughter had disappeared, replaced by admiration, reflection, and sincere regret. The young merchant who had first mocked her shoes slowly stepped forward, removing his cap before lowering his head. "Miss Collins," he said quietly, his voice filled with embarrassment, "I judged you without knowing your heart. I am deeply sorry." Emma smiled with gentle kindness. "Thank you for saying that. I hope we both leave today a little wiser than yesterday." Her answer surprised everyone listening. There was no bitterness in her voice, no desire to embarrass those who had embarrassed her. She accepted the apology with the same grace she had shown while carrying herbs to strangers and helping neighbors who could never repay her. One by one, others approached. The young women who had whispered cruel remarks lowered their eyes and apologized sincerely. Parents gently encouraged their children to thank Emma for every act of kindness they had quietly forgotten. Mrs. Evelyn Harper embraced Emma warmly while tears of gratitude filled her eyes. The elderly man whose grain she had carried smiled proudly, as though watching his own granddaughter receive the honor she had always deserved. Benjamin observed every exchange without interrupting. He understood that forgiveness offered freely often transformed hearts more deeply than punishment ever could. As they reached the far side of the village square, he finally slipped his boots back onto his feet. The gesture felt complete. It had never been about walking barefoot forever. It had been about ensuring no one would ever again mistake outward appearance for inward worth. Before climbing onto his waiting horse, Benjamin turned once more toward the gathered villagers. "Respect cannot be reserved only for those wearing crowns," he said calmly. "If you wait for greatness before choosing kindness, you will overlook the greatest people standing beside you every day." His words settled gently into every listening heart. Emma looked around the square, where familiar faces now smiled warmly instead of laughing. For the first time since losing her parents, she no longer felt invisible within the place she had always called home. She had not become someone different. The village had finally learned to see the woman she had been all along, and as the evening sun painted the snowy streets with soft golden light, Ashwood quietly welcomed back not an orphan defined by hardship, but a daughter whose dignity had never truly been lost. Winter gradually gave way to early spring, and with the changing season came changes no one in Ashwood could have imagined only a few months before. The story of the orphan Omega and the Alpha King who had chosen to walk beside her spread far beyond the village, traveling across neighboring packs until it reached every corner of the kingdom. Yet each time the tale was told, Benjamin Foster gently corrected those who focused only on the moment he had removed his boots. "The lesson was never about me," he would quietly say. "It was always about learning to recognize goodness before someone important points it out." True to his words, the Alpha King returned to Ashwood shortly after the first flowers began blooming along the forest paths. This time he arrived openly with his royal council, community leaders, and craftsmen from across the kingdom. The villagers gathered once again in the central square, wondering what purpose had brought the Crown Pack back to their peaceful home. Benjamin stood before them without unnecessary ceremony. "Every child deserves opportunity," he said. "Every Omega deserves dignity. Every person deserves to be seen for their character rather than their circumstances. He announced the creation of a new royal initiative that would provide clothing, education, apprenticeships, and seasonal support for orphaned children and struggling Omega families throughout every allied pack. The program would be funded directly by the crown and supported by volunteers from villages across the kingdom. The council members revealed detailed plans for new learning houses, herb gardens, and community workshops where practical skills would be shared freely with anyone willing to learn. Then Benjamin surprised everyone once again. He asked Emma Collins to become the first community advisor for the initiative, explaining that no royal official understood quiet compassion better than the woman who had practiced it every day without recognition. Emma immediately looked overwhelmed. "Your Majesty," she said softly, "there are many wiser people than I am." Benjamin smiled warmly. "Wisdom is measured by the lives it improves, not by the titles it carries." The council members nodded in agreement. Even the village elders expressed their full support. Emma accepted only after asking one condition. "Please promise me this program will never make anyone feel ashamed for accepting help." Benjamin answered without hesitation. "That promise was made the day I first watched you help others without asking anything in return." During the ceremony, one of the royal craftsmen carefully placed Emma's old repaired shoes inside a handcrafted wooden display case protected by clear glass. Many expected the worn shoes to be replaced with beautiful new ones, but Emma quietly requested otherwise. "These shoes remind me that difficult roads can still lead somewhere beautiful," she explained. A small bronze plaque was placed beneath the display with a simple inscription that every visitor would read before entering the new community hall. It said, "Character travels farther than appearance." Children often stopped to study the old shoes with curious eyes while their parents shared the story behind them. Instead of becoming a symbol of poverty, they became a reminder that kindness often walks unnoticed until someone chooses to see it. As spring sunshine filled the village square where laughter had once carried a very different meaning, Ashwood discovered that its greatest treasure had never been hidden beneath a royal crown or inside a castle. It had quietly walked among them every single day wearing patched leather shoes, carrying healing herbs, and offering compassion that expected nothing in return. And because one king had chosen to honor that truth, an entire kingdom slowly learned to honor it as well. 1 year later, the first day of the Harvest Moon Festival returned to Ashwood, but the village no longer resembled the place it had once been. The same stone streets stretched through the town, the same ancient oak watched over the square, and the same mountain breeze carried the scent of fresh bread and pine through the air. Yet something far more important had changed. The people had changed. Children now greeted every traveler with warm smiles before noticing the clothes they wore. Merchants proudly kept a small basket near their stalls where anyone in need could quietly take gloves, scarves, or sturdy shoes without questions or embarrassment. The community hall stood where an empty storage building had once been, filled each day with laughter, learning, and neighbors helping one another. Inside its entrance, protected behind clear glass, rested the old pair of carefully repaired leather shoes that had become one of the kingdom's most treasured reminders. Visitors often paused before the display, reading the simple words beneath it before continuing inside. Many left carrying more than supplies. They left carrying a different way of seeing the people around them. Emma Collins continued living in her small cottage at the edge of the forest despite receiving countless invitations to move into larger homes prepared for her by grateful families. She thanked each person sincerely, but always chose to remain where her parents had once lived. Every morning she still gathered herbs before sunrise, still visited elderly neighbors, and still offered comfort wherever it was needed. The only difference was that she no longer walked unnoticed. Children happily waved when she passed. Families invited her to their celebrations. Young apprentices often followed her through the forest, eager to learn the healing knowledge she shared so generously. Respect had finally found the woman who had never stopped giving it away. On the opening afternoon of the festival, a familiar group of royal riders appeared once again at the northern gate. This time no one looked surprised. The villagers welcomed Alpha King Benjamin Foster with genuine affection rather than fearful ceremony. Benjamin smiled as he walked through the square, greeting children by name and thanking volunteers who had helped expand the community program into neighboring villages. When he reached the entrance of the community hall, he quietly stopped before the display containing Emma's old shoes. For a long moment, he simply looked at them, remembering the cold winter afternoon when a simple choice had revealed the true heart of an entire village. Emma soon joined him, carrying a basket filled with fresh herbs just as she had done countless times before. Benjamin glanced at the basket and smiled. Some things never change. Emma returned the smile. The important ones should not. They stepped outside together as festival music drifted across the square. Families laughed together. Children played freely without leaving anyone behind. The young merchant who had once mocked Emma now volunteered every weekend at the community hall, carefully fitting new shoes for children whose families struggled through difficult seasons. Mrs. Evelyn Harper sat comfortably near the fountain, surrounded by neighbors who never allowed her to feel alone. Looking across the joyful village, Benjamin quietly said, "A kingdom becomes stronger every time kindness becomes ordinary." Emma nodded thoughtfully before answering. And every ordinary act of kindness becomes extraordinary once someone decides to keep passing it forward. The evening sun slowly settled behind the mountains, covering Ashwood in warm golden light that reflected gently across the rooftops and winding streets. As villagers gathered together beneath glowing lanterns, no one remembered the old shoes with laughter anymore. They remembered them with gratitude. They remembered the orphan Omega who never allowed hardship to steal her compassion, and the Alpha King who understood that true leadership begins by walking beside those the world overlooks. Long after the music faded and the festival ended, the story continued, traveling from one village to another, reminding everyone who heard it that the greatest measure of a person will never be found in what they wear, what they own, or where they begin, but in the quiet choices they make when kindness is the only reward, because true strength is always gentle, and love has always possessed the power to restore what dignity never truly lost.